We've not long had the first practice sessions of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, so in this video I'll unpack what we learned about race pace, some of the team's strengths and weaknesses, but also the driver battles, including how exactly Lewis Hamilton went fastest and how off the pace Max Verstappen and Red Bull might be. So firstly then, here's your race pace chart, and we can see that Leclerc and Hamilton are heading up the field, although they only did 3 laps each. They spent most of the time working on short runs. Hamilton did it on the medium, Leclerc on the soft. Hamilton was about a tenth off of Leclerc's pace on average. One of the few drivers to do some much longer stints were the Williams drivers. We saw Albon here, one of the few that actually ran a hard tyre, and he did look competitive. Sainz slightly slower, a couple of tenths slower on the medium, but both of them not looking too bad. Of course, we've got Piastri here, potentially on higher fuel, which is why he sits behind the Ferraris. And of course, there's an absence of Norris after he hit that concrete wall pretty hard on his left rear. Antonelli here, looking in a similar pace category to Piastri. Meanwhile, we've got the Red Bulls here. It looks like there were a couple of laps that were maybe a yellow flag influenced up here. Which maybe is why Verstappen is looking slower than Tsunoda. But overall, if you look at his times, he's doing a mid 46, whereas if we look at the Ferrari times, they were doing a low to mid 46, so up to half a second difference between those two. So now moving on to quicker laps with the sector breakdown. This is your sector 1 of all the drivers. We can see the Ferraris looking pretty dominant out front. Russell not doing too badly behind, whereas McLaren were struggling a little bit, although that is slightly skewed because they did not spend as much time, and Norris especially after the crash did not spend as much time doing quick runs. Here's sector 2. Again, we've got the Ferraris up front. Mercedes, Red Bull not looking too bad. The interesting one to look at, though, is Sector 3, because all of a sudden, Liam Lawson is at the very front of the field, and Isaac Hadjar isn't too far behind him either. And interestingly, if we look at the lap chart for Sector 3, which is the red one, it's pretty much just a straight line. And so we're basically seeing incredible straight line speed and acceleration from those racing bulls. And then if we move over to look at the gap to the ideal best lap time, so if you put all of the best sectors together and use that as a benchmark, we see Hamilton is of course the closest because he finished at the top of the sheets, but he's actually 3.5 tenths off, and that is all, again, that's this red bar, so that's sector 3. That's that straight line where racing bulls are excelling. And that's why on Liam Lawson's bar here, you see it is only blue and yellow. There's no red because he has the fastest sector 3. Leclerc then is losing a little bit in sector 1 and sector 2 to Hamilton because Hamilton clearly has the fastest sectors 1 and 2. Russell is then 0.8 off. If we move down to Verstappen here, losing equally in all sectors, he's about a second off there. So now just to validate that, looking at the team performance on the quickest lap of each team, we can see Racing Bulls with the highest top speed. Now Liam Lawson did have a toe on that lap, which does slightly skew the data. However, having looked at some laps where he didn't have a toe, that Racing Bulls is still the quickest car in a straight line. Perhaps not by quite as much. This Ferrari is also skewed as slightly slower in a straight line because Lewis Hamilton did not have a big toe on his quick lap. We see McLaren, Red Bull, Mercedes sat in a very similar group of straight line speed. Sauber surprisingly right up there. But of course the picture changes a bit when you go to mean speed. Ferrari, of course, the quickest car over the lap overall. They're doing the best. Red Bull are then in second, not too far behind. And if we look at that here on the chart, we see Ferrari. So to the right of this chart, because this is mean speed along the bottom and top speed along the left, to the right of this chart is the faster cars. As you go up the chart, you get quicker cars in a straight line. So we see Racing Bulls sat up here, right at the top. Ferrari quite low down. A lot of other teams in the middle here, and this is going to be crucial for qualifying. There is a huge difference. If you've got a toe, you're up somewhere up here, and if you don't, you're going to be sat somewhere down here in the middle. So it'll be very important for teams to try and get that right track placement in qualifying. Something else interesting to look at is that on the fastest laps, if we look at for each team individually, there's actually a range of tyres going on here. We've got both the soft and the medium being used by the teams for their quickest laps. We see even here Alpine set their quickest lap on an 8-lap old medium. Of course, the tyres brought to this race are a step softer than we had last year. So that medium that we're seeing this year is actually last year's soft, and it is holding up well. We see some cars are actually struggling to hold on onto the softs around the whole lap today. Something to note on that, though, is that the track conditions are going to be getting cooler as we go through the weekend. So in qualifying, it might be that the softs are actually able to hold on a little bit better than they were today. But still, it's interesting to see that the medium today might actually have been the slightly quicker tyre. So now I wanted to compare Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc's fastest laps. Here we've got the time delta chart. So Hamilton's lap time is the reference here, and what we're seeing is how the gap to Leclerc evolves over the whole lap. So when Leclerc's line, this bright red line, is below this centre line, that means Leclerc is actually ahead at this point on the lap. Whereas when this line comes up above, that means that Hamilton is ahead, Leclerc is falling behind. And if the line is sloping downwards, that means Leclerc is gaining. Whereas if the line is sloping upwards, like here, that means Leclerc is losing to Hamilton. So something I wanted to highlight is, if you look at here at turn 4, for example, we see Leclerc gain loads of time. Here he goes massively up on Hamilton, about a tenth and a half, which is significant when you consider the gaps. He gains all of that, and then on the exit of turn 4, he not only loses that up to here, where he comes to about, less than half a tenth behind, he loses even more. Now he's well and truly behind by nearly a tenth. And then I see a similar pattern here if we look at turn 15, once I zoom in on that. Again, here Leclerc gains. He actually goes positive, or maybe negative I should say, on Hamilton. He's going quicker than Hamilton at this point. If the lap ended here, Leclerc would be faster. But then after the exit of the corner, he loses all of what he gained, and then he loses more. And interestingly, if we look at the data for this, so if we look at the braking, so let's first look at turn 4 and then we'll look at turn 15. So if we zoom in on turn 4, we'll get the full picture here. So this, quite faint to see, but this dotted line here is Hamilton. So this is where Hamilton steps on the brakes, and then this is where Leclerc steps on the brakes. So Leclerc is braking a lot later, but then he has to hold the brakes much further into the corner. You see Hamilton has already come off the brakes here, Leclerc only comes off the brakes here. And that means that Hamilton is basically using a very slow in but fast out approach. And if we look at turn 15, we'll then see the same trend. So once again here, Hamilton brakes here, Leclerc brakes later again, but Hamilton's able to release the brakes actually slightly earlier than Leclerc because he's braked earlier, and because of that he gets that advantage on corner exit, and we see this significant advantage. It's very obvious here. You see Leclerc gains and then he loses it all again, and then you go to turn 15, he gains and then loses it and more. Now, if we break this down even further, we see that Hamilton is getting a slightly higher average peak deceleration on the brakes, so he's making that braking phase work better. If we break this down even more into cornering, high-speed corners, Leclerc is on average carrying more speed than Hamilton by 8-2 if you look at the corners individually. If you add them all up and divide through, he's on average half a kilometre of an hour quicker through the high speed. Low-speed corners is a slightly more complicated story. We see that Leclerc is winning 6-4 if you look at just corners, but if you average it out, he's actually nearly a kilometre of an hour slower than Hamilton through the low speed. We see a lot of this is coming here from turn 15. Hamilton's quickest and Leclerc is 8 kilometers of an hour down. Turn 15 is this very challenging braking zone near the end of the lap. So now I also wanted to bring Verstappen into things to see how he stacks up compared to the Ferraris. Interestingly, if we look at the time delta again, so this is with Hamilton as the reference lap, we see that Verstappen and Leclerc, as we saw earlier, are actually quicker than Hamilton through turns 1 and turns 2, but you'll then see that this blue line for Verstappen drops off massively. He ends the lap about 6/10 off, but overall he's just losing through nearly every corner. If we look at the speed trace though, we'll get a better picture of the whole story, and something I notice here is how the blue line is suspiciously sitting quite significantly below the two red lines in most of the high speed sections where the drivers will be just simply on full throttle. And to me, this either looks like Verstappen has a detuned engine, or that his electrical deployment was perhaps also detuned slightly, not through any fault of the car, but through the team's own strategy to reduce engine wear, etc. Of course, that'll get turned up for qualifying. So is Verstappen off the pace? Well, not necessarily. I think we have more to see from Red Bull and him. Now, I've also just brought in Russell quickly to investigate whether he might be down on power. And to be honest, looking at these traces, if we look at this speed trace here, it looks like his car is accelerating well, in fact, slightly better than the Ferrari and the Red Bull. So there isn't a strong argument to say that Mercedes is particularly down-tuned on power so far. Now, what about McLaren? Well, now here's Piastri's lap on that chart with Hamilton and Verstappen. Interesting trend here is while Verstappen's line comes down in the mid-corner, Piastri's line actually goes up, so he's losing through the mid-corner. And we saw that McLaren looked very snappy in the low speed, which caused incidents for both of their drivers. Again, looking at low speed, we can zoom in on the speed chart just for these minimum speed zones. We see here McLaren sat with the lowest minimum speed, which is a bad thing. Here, Red Bull Here again, McLaren. So is that car not particularly well set up for the low speed yet? It is possible. In a straight line, they aren't looking too bad. They here sit slightly down below, but here into turn 14, 15, McLaren don't look too bad. So could it be all to play for? I think absolutely. McLaren haven't shown their full hand, and also Verstappen hasn't shown his full hand once that engine gets tuned up, although perhaps McLaren actually have a bit of setup work to do if they want to find that pace. So that's all the data I have for you in this video. It is looking like an interesting weekend, worth keeping an eye out on to see how it develops. If you want to join the conversation, do comment down below, perhaps your predictions, but you can also join our Discord server via the link in the description. Anyway, that's everything. Come back on Sunday for the race insights, but that's all, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.